Hey friends, thanks for joining me, Jim Barut, to hear a few insights from leaders who represent our innovation ecosystem. Today's chat is with Anya Kamenetz, an education correspondent for NPR and the author of The Stolen Year: How COVID Changed Children's Lives and Where We Go Now.
Thanks for having me, Jim. This is exciting. So I graduated college kind of into the post 9/11 recession. I started interning at the Village Voice newspaper, which was kind of on its last legs at the time. And I started writing a column called Generation Debt, which was about young people like myself and the millennial generation and all of the reasons why we might not be doing as well economically as our parents. And actually, we're the first generation, the millennials became the first generation not to do as well economically as their parents at the same age in terms of milestones like buying a house or just being financially independent. So my kind of the work that I was doing there led me into this conversation around student loans. And I got the opportunity to write a book pretty quickly, I would say, before I really knew what I was doing. And the book Generation Debt was really about kind of just the various aspects of being a millennial. So credit cards, but also student loans, also the changes in the job market, the evolution towards the gig economy. And because of that book, I toured the country. I talked to students and learned about their experiences and saw a vast range of higher education experiences that I really didn't know much about. So that led me almost directly to my next book, which came out in 2010, and it was called DIYU. And that was really interesting. So by that time, I was working at Fast Company and covering technology and innovation. And I saw that there was this, with broadband and then with mobile, all of these new affordances for learning, the cost of learning could be sort of very different from what we expected it. It could be democratized. And then I saw that there was this demand. I saw a lot of people paying, the cost of tuition had risen more than any other good or service in the consumer pricing index for 20 years. And so, how can you keep charging more and more for this product when it's not necessarily matching the needs of the job market? And then in the technology business, especially, you saw people that were coming to the top of the industry that were not even having college degrees. They were self-taught. In fact, if you wanted to be fluent in the programming languages and the ways that people were making these new technologies, you couldn't learn that in a college course because it wasn't being taught in college. You had to go out on your own. You have to be with Stack Overflow. So there's all this peer-to-peer learning going on. So because of this unique intersection, so like I was visiting colleges, but I was also like in the tech, covering the tech industry, I was able to spot this trend as it was emerging of kind of the massive open online courseware movement and boot camps and the just sort of all these efforts to democratize higher ed. So that was my Fast Company time. Then I had my own kids. So I turned 30, had my own kids, and got really interested in K-12 education, as people do. I published some interesting stories in that time around sort of mobile and kids. So like how the mobile technologies were kind of changing, how kids were interacting with the iPad, which was so fascinating. But I was interested in sort of, okay, so I see what educational innovation is happening in the higher ed space, what's happening in K-12. And what I came to realize was that actually very little is happening in K-12, or what is happening is very much pushed to the margins. And the reason for that is this standardized testing regime that is completely rigid and is completely dominating and distorting kind of the enterprise of education. So that was my book, The Test, where I kind of very policy heavy. And for that book, I really learned a lot more about the history of education in America and different theories of education. But really it was about how do we measure intelligence? What do we even think of as intelligence? Are we incentivizing the right things in our education system? What is excellence? What is, achievement? And do these test scores, do these bell curves really, give us what we need? So yeah, that was my third book. And I was 5 years at Fast Company. It was a really great time. And then I kind of took a step back. I had a second kid, and I got interested in this thing I'd been looking at a few years before, which was kids and their interaction with mobile devices, and kind of what does the science say actually about all these kids and the screen time in their brains. So this statistic was haunting me, which was that kids are spending more time with their devices than they're actually spending in school, right? Because hours per day, we're talking about hours and hours per day, and then it's every day of the year. So the common sense media shows like 0 to 8, like kids spending 4 or 5 hours a day with devices. By the time they get to be tweens, it's like 8, 9 hours a day. And then adults forget about it, right? When are we not on our devices? That's the question. So that was a really fun research project, kind of getting in with people who were doing this kind of research and evidence, and trying to answer the questions that I had, that a lot of parents had. The Art of Screen Time was that book. How do we make these choices? What kind of lives do we want our kids to have, knowing that the world is changing, and the perfect parenting doesn't mean like you're reproducing exactly what you experience. You kind of want your kids to have something different. So between those two books, 2014, I started working at NPR and covering education. And so there was, just a really incredible opportunity to see how education operated as this massive institution in our society, with 55 million K-12 students, 20 million undergraduates, touches almost every aspect of American life and global life. And yeah, so that's been a pretty exciting run. During that time, obviously 2020, the pandemic happened, and that kind of leads us up to where we're at right now.
Yeah, no, you've seen so much, from your perch, which is really why I'm so excited to learn from this conversation as a parent myself, just selfishly, right? But
yeah,
for the broader, societal impact. So you mentioned your books, and what I'd love for you to do is sort of take us through those books and say, where have we come on debt, right? Have we made progress on each of those,
oh yeah.
each of those? But before I do that, one of the things you mentioned were the MOOCs,
Yeah.
right? And the MOOCs, I watch those very closely because, as you may know, I worked in academia for a long time, and the promise was there. And I'd be curious to, before you get to your books, just talk about where we've come, regarding the MOOCs, the hype, the promise, and the reality.
So this is so interesting. So in the spring, I was invited to the 20th anniversary celebration of MIT OpenCourseWare. Yeah, right. And think about, so MIT OpenCourseWare, for people that don't know, this was pre-broadband, it was pre-MOOC. It was this very kind of skunkworks effort to bring MIT's courses, the basic lecture notes, and again, just lecture notes, and put them up on the web for anyone to see. And it was this part of this utopian era of invention of Creative Commons licensing, open content all across the board. And that really kind of coming out of the libraries of the universities, and like the parts of the universities that are intellectually open to the world. But, at that same time, that same semester, I think, or maybe just a few months before, MIT had gotten to this deal, right, between 2U and edX. And there was, hundreds of millions of dollars changed hands. And that represented kind of the commercialization of this idea, right? Where, basically universities are charging similar or the same tuition for online programs that might be more convenient, but they're not necessarily more accessible. In fact, they're cash cows for institutions. And there are these for-profit partnerships that are, publicly, companies that are having IPOs, and there's this, there's an ed tech gold rush. And meanwhile, OCW, the OpenCourseWare project within MIT, had really kind of languished. It didn't have the support that it needed institutionally, and there wasn't a very clear mandate or message to faculty as to why they should be engaged in it. It was something that people still kind of discovered on their own and maintained basically as hobbies. But the mission of the university, OpenCourseWare never managed to get to the core mission of the institution and change it from the inside. I think people were really utopian in their vision of how that might work, frankly, I don't think it could have worked, because I think that the institutions are based on exclusivity, at least the ones that hold the cultural power, right? And so basically giving the store away is something they were never, ever going to do. And knowledge without networks, I think we've all learned, doesn't have the same value.
So, but there was, well, educating masses, right? The benefits were amazing, right? And there were stories
Yes.
of people taking these courses and ultimately getting into MIT, or ultimately, getting into the system, right? So what about that impact and those stories, that even though it was a tiny, tiny, tiny segment of those people that took the courses?
So I think you can completely flip around what I just said and say that the benefits of the open courseware movement have become completely taken for granted, to the point where we don't even credit open courseware for it. But like the fact that you can open up YouTube and learn to be a beekeeper and learn to be an accountant and learn to deliver a baby, that all of this is absolutely something that people in our age group, my kids, if they want to know what sound a beaver makes, they just ask Alexa. Like, the democratization of knowledge has completely happened, like in that way. And not only that, I mean, if people can find themselves communities, and they can find themselves teachers, and there's an incredible amount of sort of peer-to-peer or like democratized teaching that goes on. You can find really good teachers and tutors and people that, across boundaries. During the very beginning of the pandemic, OutSchool was a platform that exploded, where people had live video-based teaching that was passion-driven, that really was something that kids wanted and needed at that time. So I think that, yeah, there was a movement. What happened, it's the movement, and this happens a lot in the history of media, right? A new medium will emerge, but it doesn't get rid of the old medium. It just gets layered on top, right? So open learning emerged, and it's very real, and the benefits of this in our world today, but it in no way endangered the incumbency of the elites.
Let's move on to the topics covered in your books, and where we are today, and if there's been progress, and where you're hopeful.
Yeah. So when I wrote Generation Debt, the percentage of people that were borrowing money for college had crossed 50% just in the 90s. So it was like 7 or 8 years out from that. And it really wasn't taken seriously as a real problem. People were like, well, you have a college degree, so why are you complaining? I was gratified to see gradually, through Occupy, through Bernie Sanders, through many iterations, student loan forgiveness become like a mainstream Democratic position. Like, that's something that credits all of these activists and people that work tirelessly to say, actually, we should be taken seriously. The millennials had to turn 40 for it to happen. So there's a lot of people with multi-generational student loan debt, and the impact's very real. But that's been, that's something where I see a bright spot to that. I see some evolution there. When it comes to DIYU, we kind of talked about that, right? Higher ed, there was a promise. I think the higher education sector has changed, maybe more like, it's like less than you might imagine in 1 year, but more than you might imagine in 10 years. I think that the global nature of the market is very established. I think that the pandemic did a lot to, push the acceptance of remote learning even farther. College enrollment is dropping in the United States, and that had happened. We had a demographic problem already, but college enrollment is dropping. There's interest in trade schools and 2 to 4 year colleges is growing. I think the overall equation is changing in people's minds. And it's hard. The squeeze is going to be on a lot of institutions, but the elites are still winning. Like, they're still, even in an environment where enrollment's dropping, you see like Harvard, Stanford getting record numbers of applications. So the hegemony of like these institutions that are older than the United States, I don't think gets challenged in that scenario. The K-12, so the test, another thing that happened in the pandemic was that standardized testing was suspended. And that was fascinating. For the first time in 20 years, we didn't have state standardized testing at a national level in 2020. And then even in 2021, there was a lot of reduction in who could take part in it because of the pandemic. So I think that the headlock that standardized testing has had on schools may be loosening. The other thing that happened kind of without, and this is something I called out in my book, which is, okay, you have kids doing software, they're doing math on software every day. They're doing reading exercises on software every day. There is no need to bring school to a screeching halt for 2 weeks to fill in bubbles. You have a year's worth of data on growth You have every problem that they solved. You understand their learning and their progress. And during the pandemic, those software companies released that data, that information, and it helped people understand what kids were missing. And so gradually, now it hasn't been incorporated yet into state accountability programs. So my children, my sixth grader, fifth grader, did have to go to do state testing. And her school also is one that has a very diverse population and works really hard to get the kids, it's still important and they're still making them do this stupid waste of time testing. But I feel like it's more brittle, more fragile than you might imagine. The artist screen time, I mean, it was crazy. During the pandemic, obviously screen time exploded. Parents are at the end of their wits. They're very worried, all this stuff about, the Facebook whistleblower and concerns about, kids' mental health and what it's doing to them. So I think that, the concerns raised in that book are as alive as ever. What's also the case that I like to see is that there's more understanding of the fact that it's not just about time on device, but it's about what you're doing. And that during the pandemic, screens were a lifeline for many, many kids, that they needed that social contact. They needed the world as they perceived it through their screens. And so I hope that there's a more compassionate, empathetic understanding of how we parent with screens in the world. So I still give presentations on the art of screen time. I still think it's very dear to my heart. Yeah.
And so just for parents, as we sort of ease out of, or try to have our kids be on screens less, is there sort of a general approach that you advise parents?
Yeah. Two things. The general approach is listen and empathize. You want to do co-viewing. You want to know what your kids are doing online and have that line of communication open with a sympathetic air to you. So, our kids can't just be hearing all the time, turn that off. I hate you doing that. They need to know that you understand why it's so compelling, and you need to understand why it's so compelling. And then the other really big one is just what are you doing with your screens? Are you able to capable of modeling focused attention? Do you have screen-free meals and screen-free family time? Because they're going to learn from what you do.
Right. Okay. Now, what about, I use something called Custodio, it's surveillance. What's your take on that surveillance software and things like that? Is that a good approach?
I know that they're in really wide use. I think that, parenting philosophies differ. And it's also kind of, I believe that, in the world of the legal and in the legal world, right? You can get a wiretap on somebody if you have probable cause, right? If you're going to surveil someone, you need to go to a judge and say, this is what we think this person's up to, and this is why we need to listen in. So the trust but verify approach, and it depends on the age of the kid, but really I feel like you should have a justification to say, what is it that you think your kid is up to, that you're snooping or that you're looking over their shoulder? Because it shreds trust. If you find something out by snooping and then you come to them with it, there's going to be two aspects. One is the thing you're confronting them with, and the other is the fact that you spied on them, when they didn't necessarily think about the fact that you were looking. So I don't do it with my own kids. I think that there's understandable reasons why parents might feel like they need to. And I think that it just has to be supplemented with a ton of communication and hopefully buy-in, so that you don't destroy the trust that you need. Ultimately, you're going to need the trust, because if a kid wants to hide something from you, then they're going to find a way to do it. They're going to get on a VPN. They're going to go to their friend's house. They're going to borrow their friend's device. They're going to have a fake Instagram account. If they want to hide, they'll find a way to hide. So the question is, how do you have enough trust in that relationship that you're going to discover the things that they're truly in trouble, or that they'll hopefully come to you?
Right. No, that's great. That's great advice. But in general, should you limit social media? You would say yes, right?
Well, I don't like kids. The main boundary that I ask parents to think about is sleep, because it's so well supported. And also that unsupervised time at night is a time where kids can really get into a rabbit hole. We all do it. Right. So doing devices out of the bedroom, and guarding sleep. In terms of limiting overall time on social media, different kids use social media for different things. And You might have a kid. For example, I had a friend who they were like, you can get an Instagram account, but it's only for pictures of the dog, right? So they're taking pictures and they're learning to curate an account and interact with followers. And it's like a totally positive experience. They're not putting their body image on the line. They're not dealing with social things. They have a very specific niche that they're pursuing. So helping your kid think about how different uses of social media, I think, can be good. I mean, even for you, like opening up your LinkedIn, how do you use LinkedIn? Do your kids know about that? Is it something that, they understand that this could be part of a business that you're running? That's interesting stuff.
Right. No, that's good guidance. Okay. So let's talk about your new book and most importantly, the topic you cover, right? The effects of the pandemic.
Yeah. So when the pandemic started, I was here in my home office and I was covering education for National Public Radio, which meant I was reporting on, the schools as they started to shut down all over the country, as my own daughter's schools were shutting down. And I knew immediately that it was going to be a really big deal because I had covered Katrina and the aftermath of Katrina. And in New Orleans, schools were shuttered for several weeks. But kids mostly enrolled quickly elsewhere. But even though they enrolled quickly elsewhere, missed only a couple of weeks of school, the lingering effects stretched over a decade. So college enrollment was down, high school graduation was down, and kids took years to catch up academically. So faced with like a social catastrophe that also closed the schools, I knew that the effects were going to be major and detrimental. And then as the pandemic continued on, I saw European countries opening their schools up, and we were not. And we were failing to get the pandemic under control. There was division, polarization. No one could agree on what safety measures to use. So it was something that I felt like really needed to be told from the experiences of people that were living through it. And I started following families around the country. And the book follows 5 families from different parts of the country as they go through this year, the first year of the pandemic. And I dive into kind of the impacts on poverty, on children with special needs, on children with mental health, who develop mental health problems, mental health issues, on kids in really marginalized kids in the foster care system, kids in the in juvenile justice settings, and also what happened to caregivers, what happened to childcare providers, and what happened to moms and other primary caregivers. And all of it is kind of building the case that we failed to put kids first in our response to the pandemic in any way. And because of that, kids suffered, and we need to do something about it.
Got it. And so you mentioned comparing us with other countries. Why didn't we sort of pivot more quickly?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we managed the pandemic really badly. So we had a lot of sickness. Countries like New Zealand were able to reopen their schools because they didn't have a lot of COVID, and Japan, right? Among the countries like in Europe that had waves of COVID, they quickly established the principle, and the European equivalent of the CDC was very, very clear on this, that schools should be last resort. You should close them last and open them first. And so that was a very clear centralized message. Those countries, UK, Spain, Italy, also outside Israel, they have centralized school systems. They have federal education ministers, national education ministers that said, this is going to be the rules. This is when we're going to open. This is when we're going to close. We don't have that. We have 13,000 districts, and they each have their own democratically elected boards. So there was no unanimity. But what also happened here, of course, is that we had a leader who was completely polarizing the issue of school reopening and not offering any resources to schools. So if you run a school district, in April is when you're doing your staffing plan for the next fall. That's when you're scheduling. That's when you're figuring out the logistics and the resources. So April 2020, obviously, schools were standing up their remote learning plans and their emergency feeding plans. And then they were still hoping and thinking, oh, maybe this will be over by July, maybe it'll be over by August. And so as it got closer and closer to school reopening, it was actually like, oh shit, we don't have the resources. We didn't even make the plan. And also we have to do 2 things. We have to do a remote learning plan, and an in-person learning plan, or we have to figure out the hybrid, and we have to figure out staffing for that. We have to figure out accommodations for teachers that have health issues. We don't have any extra resources for any of this. And it's a freaking pandemic and we're all freaking out. So districts had very hard jobs and they had very little help from above. And that is why we muffed the school reopening process so badly. But I also blame blue state leaders who allowed bars to open while schools were closed. They allowed dog parks to open while playgrounds were closed. We just didn't put kids first.
That is so distressing.
Yeah.
But so you talk about all the negative effects and how we failed. Did we learn? Are things better now?
Okay, those are two different questions. We learned a lot. School systems that had done the same things the same way for decades suddenly pivoted essentially overnight. And they did learn from that experience. Some of them burnt out, but figuring out that they're, going from there's no way we can do this to we have to do this is a huge learning experience for everybody. I think that people internalized the importance of social and emotional skills and relationships within schools in a totally new way. So I see now when I talk to school leaders that they may have said that was a nice thing to have before, but now they understand if I want my kids to come back to school, they need to trust and know and like the people in the building, and the building needs to be a safe place. So that is something that people learned. Has it gotten better? In some places, yes. In some places, no. So the state of Tennessee just reported that they are the first state to catch up in those. We talked about how problematic test scores are, but given the test scores that we have, kids are back on their 2019 trajectory in the state of Tennessee. And this is a combination of better pay for teachers, better training, extended school year, extended school day, small high dose tutoring and small groups. So they're doing all the things that all the states are supposed to do, but for some reason, Tennessee got back on track. So some places are getting better. And then a lot of places are still suffering. So failure rates and chronic absenteeism in the largest school districts in the country are really off the charts right now. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and enrollment is down. Enrollment is down in public school districts, especially in big cities, all over the place. And that's really bad news. We need kids to be like, some of those kids are being homeschooled to varying impact. Some of those kids are in charter schools, fine. In private schools, okay. They vary in quality. But some of them are gone. And that's very bad. We were making progress on high school graduation rates. We hit an all-time high in graduation rates before the pandemic. And, whether or not that progress is being erased, it still kind of remains to be seen. Like 2020 was like, they basically graduated all those kids no matter what they did. 2021, it varied. 2022, we're still waiting on the information, but it's bad news. And it's really bad news that college going is down as much as it is, because the US has suffered a lot more than other countries in that regard.
Right. And you mentioned homeschool. That had been going up over the past many years, I think, or engagement with homeschool. What's your take on that? Was this just a quick bubble and back down, or is it helping sort of that trend?
Oh, I think the change is here to stay. I think that so many more families figured out a way for it to work for them, and they saw the trade-offs. What's really fascinating to me is the diversity of the new families that have come into homeschooling. So, homeschooling used to be kind of much more predominantly white, and the families that are starting to homeschool now are more likely to be Black and Hispanic. And a lot of that has to do with what they perceive as, structural racism and microaggressions that they experience within the school system. And some of that has to do with George Floyd. It has to do with Black Lives Matter. It has to do with, just not being willing to take it anymore. And so, and then there's also just the increasing awareness of, the availability of different curricula and, homeschool resources, and districts handed out millions, have thousands of hotspots and laptops. So there's a lot more equipment in the hands of parents, and parents are more likely to be able to work from home. So I think it's here to stay. And I think it's it's going to be important because you see that homeschool families have a different take on the whole education debate, and the kinds of policies that they're pushing for are very different.
And is the quality all over the place, or are there now sort of turnkey options that parents could take advantage of?
Both of those things are true. The quality is all over the place, and there are turnkey options that parents can take advantage of. States really vary in the amount of regulation and oversight that they give to homeschool families. Historically, families that had opted into homeschooling under normal conditions had pretty good outcomes as far as their kids. Basically no better nor worse. So some are worse, some are better, but for all things held equal, a kid stays home intentionally and works with a parent, they're just as likely to kind of be contributing members of society. They even go to high school and college at like decent rates. So, are we going to see, the thing is that public schools vary a lot in quality as well. So it's really hard to say like on a large basis, because every family is different, whether homeschooling is better or worse for that individual child. But there are definitely, I definitely have heard concerns from district leaders, and let's be fair, like these are people that are opting out of the product that they sell, right? But district leaders saying like, I don't really think it's homeschooling. I think it's just like a parent wants help with the younger siblings, or they're not really investing in kids' education, or they don't even know, like maybe they're not that educated themselves. So there's variations in quality, and there's reasons to be concerned. But the problem is that public schools, again, vary so much in quality that you have to be able to say like what we're offering is better than what you can do at home. And not every school can say that to every family, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I hear you loud and clear. What about the prospect of charter schools and private schools, parochial schools? Have those become stronger, or is it depends on sort of location, geography, et cetera?
Well, it's a lot of variation. It was a surprisingly mixed bag. So in the first year of the pandemic, a lot of private schools went under, especially Catholic schools. And that was pure economics, in some ways. Some places, private schools were, they didn't have the money. They had people that were interested in coming, but they didn't have necessarily the money to expand to take more students in, especially with social distancing. And then there were some localities where private schools were prohibited to open when public schools were prohibited to open. So they weren't allowed to compete, in other words. But then, of course, there were more affluent places where, yes, private schools were able to offer a safer, better experience for kids, or at least more perceived more as safe for kids. And they might have gained ground, or at least gained interest. So again, it's kind of all over the map. Charter schools, there's been headwinds there. I feel like the charter school movement is a complicated one. So virtual charter schools boomed during the pandemic. These are often for profit. They have very, very serious concerns about their quality of other offerings. After gaining a ton of students in 2020 school year, they didn't necessarily retain a lot of those students. They were flat or down. This is the K-12 and the connections. In the regular charter school, brick and mortar charter school world, I'm not as up to date on what the policy changes might be there, but I think that there's definitely interest in growing and maintaining at least the charter school offerings that are there. And I observed that a lot of charter school networks were a little bit more nimble in their responses to the pandemic, because they had different management structure, and they had a little more cohesion, hopefully, and ability to set policies across different schools in a network, where districts, were still going district by district and still dealing with like angry members of the public showing up. The whole idea of being like a choice school system is like, well, if you don't like it, you can go someplace else.
Yeah.
So I think that I know I sent my daughter to charter school for the first time this past year. And I was very impressed with how they handled both the communication, but also the actually administration of safety procedures. They were ahead of New York City Department of Ed in a lot of ways, and they were proactive.
Right. You talk about, the impact of the pandemic on particularly mothers, right? All the caregivers, the teachers, social workers. Talk to us about that, that what we don't know, the impact on these demographics, and, what can be done.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to overstate the emotional pressure that primary caregivers were under from the very start of the pandemic, but also all the way through. So in January of this year, I published a story about the young kids, so like the whole country opened up and there were still no vaccines for kids under 5. And so 6 months ago, 5 months ago, schools, preschools, daycares were still operating under these like sometimes 2-week quarantines, 3-year-olds wearing masks, one positive test and the whole thing shuts down. So like the entire like months, like Omicron wave, December, January, parents of young children were dealing with everyday interruptions in their childcare. And the rest of the world had moved on, essentially. People are flying on airplanes, they're going to meetings, they're, like your colleague might be getting promoted ahead of you because they can go to a conference and you can't go to a freaking conference because even if your kid's in daycare, it could get shut down the next day. So the penalty is huge. And the disappearance, the sense of disregard that families had, like nobody is really listening or paying attention to us. Nobody's making any policies with us in mind. And the pandemic relief had expired. So that money's gone. The child tax credit expired at the end of December, which was the, temporary relief that cut child poverty, but then was allowed to expire. So yeah, it's that feeling of people are really disregarding us and the toll that it took on moms in the early pandemic. So one of my unfavorite statistics is about liver disease. So there was this like spike in alcohol related liver disease in women in their 30s being admitted with like acute cirrhosis. And this is tied to like generally tied to a spike in alcohol abuse by people that just like couldn't take it anymore.
It's so distressing. And so how do we, if you had a magic wand, right, what could we do? Because we're still not out of this pandemic. I mean, but what could we do to sort of help the situation, right? All the negative impacts, but also prepare for the future.
Yeah, great question. So the number one thing I would say that we need to do is help families with a basic package of benefits that is available to every other family in the developed world. That is federal paid family leave, it is a child tax credit, and it is subsidized childcare, period. It's not an exotic proposal. It was in the Build Back Better bill. It was scuttled. Patty Murray, the senator from Washington, is trying to bring some of it back right now. Elizabeth Warren, there's lots of like advocates for it, but that's a basic. And that's a way that families could feel like not completely forgotten and like what they went through is not in vain. When it comes to what our kids need, schools got some funding, right? They got the ESSER money. They got, it's 3 years of money, expires in 2024. And there's a lot of back and forth about what the best way of dealing with what to do with that money is. It's hard for schools to use it for hiring because if they hire someone, then the money expires and then there's a cliff. And then what do you do with that after that? But the most evidence-backed measure is high dose tutoring in very small groups of kids. What was seen after Katrina, what was successful after Katrina, and part of why, the school system in New Orleans is completely remade, right, into charter school, all charter district, and a lot of outside money poured in. So in some ways, the schools the kids returned to, arguably, there was a cultural loss. At the same time, a lot of ways the schools were better than the ones that they left. And what caught the kids up was a different kind of curriculum where you don't want to mire kids in constantly repeating the same material that they missed. You have to create a spiral curriculum where they get introduced to new material while also remastering the basics that they might have gone by. And that's where software assisted learning can really help, so directed practice and making sure the kids master the basic skills, but they're still learning new material to keep them interested. And then the other way that schools can really can and are meeting the moment is, as I mentioned before, through social and emotional practices, through mental health care, public mental health as a public health measure. So every adult in a building, there's something called youth mental health first aid, which is a training, and it's happening all over the country where basically child-facing workers of any kind, and parents can do this too, learn the basics, learn how to get kids through a crisis, how to refer them, and how to foster a healthy mental health atmosphere in a school. So these are what our kids need. Some of it's happening, some of it isn't.
Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah.
But we have to do it, right? I mean, and how do you envision, I mean, are you hopeful? Number one. And, again, we're still not out of this pandemic. I mean, there may be surges ahead. Oh, there's a surge right now. As we speak in the summer here. But in the fall, during flu season, quote unquote, what are you worried about, or what are you hopeful about, and what are you worried about?
So yes, the disease burden of COVID is going to continue to affect our public policy and our public life. Like that's very clear. We're concerned about long COVID. We're concerned about, we still have hundreds of people dying every day, and you can't overlook that. Knowing what we know about the detrimental impacts of remote learning and the relatively low disease burden on children, I don't think it's justifiable to close schools or to have, mass closures or even mass quarantines. I believe in test to stay policies. I think schools should, the starting point should be that schools stay open, even when there's surges. That requires maybe different staffing. It requires, different approaches to potentially screening and quarantining and that kind of thing. And it might include masking. It definitely should include ventilation. I feel like ventilation is the one area of mitigation that we constantly overlook. That is actually a total win-win. More fresh air for everyone is better. Somehow that's like never made a cornerstone of safety. It's like masks, no masks. It's like, well, what about this one thing? Like you can't argue with it with better air. Like everybody likes it. Even if you're Republican, you like better air. So yeah, those are my thoughts about that.
Got it. This has been really fascinating and troubling at the same time. But, as a parent, what's one tip you would give us to help our kids going forward as we sort of hopefully move on from the worst parts of this pandemic?
So I've been working on a piece about post-traumatic growth, and it's something that I feature in the book as well. So resilience, we know, is something where you're basically returning to baseline and it's like nothing ever happened. But post-traumatic growth can be rare, but it's also more subtle. And it's really about kind of, how did this experience shape me? And in what ways can I frame it as being for the better? So we're not denying that the impact happened. We're not saying it's like nothing ever happened. We're saying this happened. And for that reason, I am X. I'm more grateful. I'm more patient. I'm closer to my family. I learned how to learn independently. I discovered an interest that I didn't have before. I know how to spend time alone. So delving into the positives that come out of a very negative experience. And we do that through storytelling. We talk about the negatives and the positives, but we also place it into a narrative. And I think that prompting our kids to reflect can be very healing for all of us.
Great advice. Great advice. So just to double click on that for a second.
Yeah.
We have to recognize that everyone has gone through a traumatic experience. Is that correct?
Well, I don't want to be too loose with the definition of trauma. I think that if not direct trauma, certainly vicarious trauma, certainly, a sense of powerlessness, moral injury, hopelessness. So, tough times for everyone. Absolutely.
Okay. That's good. So this has been, again, really informative, Anya. Thank you so much. We usually end with a poem or a saying or a quote from our guests. Do you have something to share?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you like my personal motto. I have two of them and they're kind of linked. So Rabbi Nachman of Wrocław has a motto that says, all the world is a very narrow bridge. The most important part is not to be afraid. Great. I'll stick with that. And linked to that in my mind, it's a little more enigmatic, but it's the what's called the epigram on my book, is from Pasternak, Boris Pasternak, the novelist. And he says, "Жизнь прожить не поле перейти," which means to live your life is not to cross a field. what I think that means, it could mean a lot of things, but what I think it means is when you stand in a field, you can see the other side of the field. All you have to do is like go there. But like getting through your life is not like that.
That is really interesting. Yes, I like that. That is really thoughtful. That is awesome. Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, that's like, those are words that I literally live by. So I'm passing them to you.
Thank you so much, Anya. This has been really great. And we look forward to checking in with you. Hopefully we will have made some progress
Yes.
next year or 2 or 5 years from now.
I hope so too.
Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please like it, leave a review, and subscribe. See you soon.